The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
It is Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario. You might not realize it, but you're a treaty person, and tonight we'll learn more about why that matters for all of us. Then we'll hear from our Ontario hubs about a major conservation initiative on Georgian Bay led by Shawanaga First Nation. And from the so-called Great Resignation to whether pro sports are toxic, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, November 5th, and that's ahead on the agenda. In many Ontario communities, it is well known that this is Treaties Recognition Week, but it's still a work in progress in a number of others. With us now to help explain why treaties are not just historical or legal documents, but potentially part of what's needed for reconciliation, let's welcome, in North Bay, journalist and educator Morris Switzer, a member of the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation, who serves in the Reconciliation Advisory Committee of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And in Elmvale, Kelly Crawford, a member of the Chigang First Nation, a treaty educator with the Anishinaabe Nation, and assistant director of Indigenous initiatives at the University of Toronto. It's very nice to meet you both.
Well, good morning.
Good morning. Before we start, I know that you both want to introduce yourselves in your language. So, Morris, we'll start with you.
Ni bojo niji benezi dijnakas wajashk dodam anashnabak angwaro dodam hodnashoni alderville donjiba North Bay and Diana Anashnabak and down.
And Kelly?
Ani, oh my goodness. Ani, Bamasha Migazekwe Indigenous Wabijeshe Dodem, Chiging Donji, Nishnabay Koyandao. So hello everyone. My name is Kelly Crawford. I'm from Mixed Heritage, and I'm a member of Chiging First Nation.
Thank you so much for doing that. Before we start talking about treaties, I just wanted to ask why that was important for you both to do that, Morris.
Well, the treaties are about the original relationship that began when newcomers first started to come to Canada, and our ancestors couldn't speak English. They ended up having to rely on translators, but our language has always been, a critical underpinning of who we are. And actually, most of the historic treaties that have been signed in Canada could not be read by the chiefs and leaders who signed them because they could not speak English, they could not write English. And that fact has actually led to a lot of controversy in court decisions involving how the treaties were presented.
And Kelly, both you and Morris are committed to teaching Ontarians about treaties. If you could take us to through the basics, what is a treaty?
Well, a treaty is it's a legal document, and I think that part of the challenge is that in the education system, this wasn't taught, right? So people often look at it like it's a thing of the past, but these are living documents. There's no expiration date. So this is an agreement between two nations that set out the roles and responsibilities. And I think that when we're looking at just how Canada's become Canada, I mean, that's what it is. I mean, that's kind of, it lays that out. And the treaty, that's the agreement to share the land. And what's in that document is, it's recognized by international law. And people need to understand, not only what treaty they live on, but what their roles and responsibilities are. Because we're all treaty people is just what that means. We're all treaty people.
And what are some of those responsibilities that we all have?
I think that fundamentally those responsibilities, it's about sharing the land. It's about taking care of the land. It's about having that connection with the land that you live on. And when you look at how the treaty process is sort of set out, essentially, agreements to share the land, but a lot of those were not honored. And when you look at where we are as Indigenous people, that has resulted in when there hasn't been a sharing of resources and land, that's where we are. So when you see that, trying to now rectify that, then you see that communities being able to build up again. And I think that when we look at different areas, certainly doing work in education, we have the average person, student or not, could tell you, this is the city or province I live in. They can't tell you the traditional territory they live on. They can't tell you what treaty area they're on. So there's very much a focus on the education system. When it first started, the reality is the education system is a tool of colonialism, right? So there's a very specific reason why people don't know about treaties. But through work of many people, one of which is with us right now, Morris, you're seeing that sort of change, right? My commitment to education around treaties is more about bringing those voices and those stories for students and teachers, so that they can kind of understand, the landscape of not only just Indigenous people in Canada, but the relationship that exists and why it exists and why we're where we're at.
And Morris, I want to build on to what Kelly was saying about the lack of education. Before we taped, I shared with you that I wasn't I didn't know about Treaties Week. I know the treaty that I'm on right now is Treaty 13. And Kelly said something, Morris, a lot of those treaties were not honored. In what ways were they not honored?
It's very important. We're heading into a Remembrance Day, Nan. I see a poppy on your lapel. And this is an ideal time for Canadians to really understand that nobody has defended Canada in greater numbers proportionally than Indigenous peoples. We were Canada's defense force in the War of 1812. Scholars and historians agree that Canada would certainly not exist in its current form. We might be part of the United States if it wasn't for 10,000 Indigenous warriors. Not only do most Canadian students I have met, not only are they not too familiar with the fact that that was the only war ever fought on their soil, but they have never heard names like Pakinawattik, Siganak, Meskwaki, Shawundas, Oshawanu. These are among Canada's greatest historical figures who played an integral role in preserving Canadian identity because they were defending their lands, and their names aren't in any textbooks that I've ever seen. So it's a very pertinent time to examine that treaty relationship, because one of the reasons that those people defended these lands was that they had made treaty to be allies of the British, who were the colonial power of the day. And so it's a really important time, and there are many gaps in Canada's education about residential schools, about treaties, about Indigenous peoples and issues in general, and not just historic examples, but we are contributing currently. The president of the Canadian Medical Association is an Indigenous man. The president of the Canadian Bar Association is an Indigenous man. We are contributing in every sphere of life in this country, in arts, in sports, in politics, in medicine. And the treaties, are a way that people can understand that relationship has started off in a positive way. Unfortunately, every single treaty, historic treaty, has been violated. And,
how did things go sideways?
Maybe it should be expected, but the relationship was positive as long as the Indigenous peoples outnumbered the newcomers. After the War of 1812, when the British felt comfortable in increasing exponentially the number of settlers that came here. It wasn't long before the Indigenous peoples were outnumbered, and when the settlers outnumbered their Indigenous hosts who had treated them so kindly and welcomed them here and shared with them, as soon as the settlers outnumbered their hosts, they started to ignore the treaty promises. They stopped having the annual treaty meetings. They stopped the gifts, which they weren't gifts, they were rent. They they continually just ignored, and people who had been promised that they would be protected even on their reserve lands from settler molestation were shot at when they went out to hunt. So that was the beginning, the end of the War of 1812 and increased settlement. That was really marked the end of the respectful observation of the promises that had been made.
Kelly, were there any attempts to, in the past, to remedy those wrongs?
In the past? Define the past. Because I think like what Morris is mentioning about 1812, it really makes me think about, following the Treaty of Niagara. And I think about, attempts to, I think as you go through that historical piece, like when Morris is mentioning 1812, and then you're seeing these different, dates in relation to treaty, then you see, Canada become Canada, and then within a couple of years, you see the Indian Act come in. So it depends on what you mean by past. I mean, I could certainly say, with land claims currently, sort of the process and that way of trying to rectify things and, coming out with jurisdiction and money to put into, different areas that we need to fix. Okay, I think you could, argue that piece. But I think when you look at the historic piece, and I often share this story. So when we think about the Treaty of Niagara, so I went to the celebration, the 250th celebration of the Treaty of Niagara, and I believe Morris was there too. And at that celebration, so we're talking about a fundamental piece that allowed for peaceful settlement. And there were 55 people there. Most of them were leadership, and there were 3 children, and 2 of them were mine. So when you think about that, I always think about that because Canada Day, everyone celebrates Canada Day. Everyone knows what Canada Day is. So this fundamental piece that allowed for peaceful settlement, and that's where we're at. That history piece that has been left out of the education system, and in my view, on purpose, it's no surprise that, there hasn't been, your question, has there been ways to rectify that? I mean, from my view, I would say no, depending on, what your definition of past is, because you're bringing in race-based legislation at that time on purpose, right? And if you look at those pieces, it really takes out or tries to take out those components of treaties.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I get the sense that there's a bit of frustration, maybe not frustration, but maybe resignation.
I just feel like with the TRC piece, for example, I feel like we have many people that have really great intentions and want to get to a place of reconciliation. So this is, it's reconciliation. But I often, from my perspective, I just feel that we're not in the truth yet. We're not in the truth yet to move into reconciliation. And when we talk about reconciliation, what is the actual action piece? Like what is going to be the fundamental shift or the change? I'm
going to go to Morris because I think for a lot of Canadians, for a lot of settlers, I think we feel entitled to this land when this land is treaty land. Morris, is that maybe that's your sense as well?
I just want to add to your question of Kelly, and yeah, frustration is mild. I want to make it clear, I've traveled a bit in my life, and there's no country in the world that I would rather live in than Canada. And that being said, as an Indigenous person, I understand that with regard to treaties, which are upheld by Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, the supreme law of this land, and have been repeatedly upheld in the Supreme Courts, the highest courts in this land. It's frustrating to see that Canada is breaking its own law or allowing its law to be broken every single day. The lobster fishers on the east coast of Canada have had their boats burned. They have been physically attacked on the docks for exercising their treaty right. And while politicians and mounted policemen stood by and allowed it to happen. On the west coast, we have people defending their traditional lands against armed guards as pipelines are driven through their traditional territories. Even if they didn't have specific treaties, they have title to those lands. The Supreme Court has upheld the Royal Proclamation's declaration 250 years ago that the nations of as they called them, the Indian tribes of North America, would be regarded as nations, and they have right to occupy their territory. And those are being ignored daily. And we understand that it's very complicated for current governments to try to untangle a mess that has been allowed to develop between federal and provincial jurisdictions, since Canada was confederated. That does not diminish the fact that the laws of this land are being broken. The relationship that started was one, as Kelly has said, of sharing the land and its resources, and yet First Nations continually have to go to court to get their rights defended. There's a major court case up here in Northern Ontario now about the Robinson-Huron Treaty that covers the land in which Kelly and I are living. And those nations, our ancestors were clever enough in 1850 to have an escalator clause built into their treaty that said that as the wealth taken from the resources on their lands increased, that their share of that wealth would increase. Well, for the last 150 years, the beneficiaries of those 21 treaty communities have been getting $4 a year. Last week, one of the companies, the resource companies that has taken trillions of dollars in wealth from Robinson-Huron lands, a company that used to be called Inco, it's today called Vale. Last week, they proudly announced a $4 billion quarterly dividend. $4 billion in 3 months profit. One Vale Inco miner makes over $100,000 a year in salary and bonuses, which is more than the $84,000 in treaty annuity payments that the 21,000 citizens of those First Nations are receiving. That is an obvious breach of the treaty agreement. And a Superior Court judge named Patricia Hennessy in 2018 ruled that indeed that escalator clause was valid, and that those 21 First Nations are still waiting for Ontario and Canada to come to the negotiating table to start rectifying the wrong.
We only have a few minutes left, but you brought up 2018. The Williams Treaty, which covers your First Nation, was lauded as being historic when it was settled by the courts in 2018. Can you give us, can you tell us about that settlement?
The Williams treaties from 1923 were regarded by scholars as the worst treaties ever implemented in Canada, because they were interpreted and deceptively so by the province and federal crowns as the Indians, as we're historically called, surrendering our right to hunt and fish on our traditional territories. That would be like people agreeing to stop eating. Nonetheless, that was the way that treaty was interpreted for almost a century. The government since apologized. It didn't help the people who went to jail for supposedly illegally hunting, or who had to sneak around at night to hunt and fish to feed their families. And in headlines, those settlements look huge. And I'm sure many Canadians think, oh, look at those Indians. They're always getting stuff for nothing. And if you just look at the land alone, the $1.1 billion settlement for 7 First Nations amounts to about $85 an acre for land that had been illegally occupied without treaty. $85 an acre. You can't buy that land in that rich part of central Ontario for less than $15,000 an acre today. So unfortunately, our leaders feel that they're forced to accept settlements to treaty before they have nothing to show for all of the years of negotiations. And the best that we can say is that these settlements are often better than nothing, but they're never, they never fairly compensate or pay restitution for the damage that has been caused, and the poverty that's been created, and the hardship that has been caused.
In our final minutes here, Kelly, you've been teaching, both you and Maurice have been teaching classrooms virtually these days. What's the one misconception about treaties that you try to address, Kelly?
Oh, the one misconception. I think that even in working with students and teachers, I don't know that it's misconception more than just not having any idea about the treaty relationship. But if I had to pinpoint it, it would probably be that it's you know, an historic document that has no impact on today, or well, it wasn't something that I signed, or it doesn't really affect. That doesn't have anything to do with me. Oftentimes when we put up a map of Ontario and I'll ask, you know, where do you think the treaty areas are? And most times they'll point to the reserves. So there's a real misunderstanding that if you're in Ontario, there's a very, very good chance, with the exception of some unceded places, that you actually live on treaty territory.
And Maurice, for you?
Well, and Kelly points out that there is that lack of understanding about, you know, what treaty land is. Most Canadians that I encounter of any age don't understand that they are treaty people. Our ancestors didn't make these treaties with themselves. Everybody in Canada is a treaty person. The difference being that non-Indigenous peoples have enjoyed their treaty rights from the wealth of the use of the land that our Indigenous ancestors agreed to share with them. Non-Indigenous peoples enjoy safe sources of drinking water, brand new schools and hospitals in their community, paved roads, all sorts of educational benefits, healthcare benefits. While the Indigenous peoples, in many cases, were promised these things, healthcare and education. We are not enjoying our treaty rights. And treaties are not, as Kelly said, ancient documents. They are still alive. There's no expiry date. Every square inch of the province of Ontario is covered by 46 treaties, every square inch. And the other thing that people seem to not really understand about treaties is that Indian treaties, as opposed to treaties like free trade agreements or the treaty that will come out of the global COP26 environmental conference, Indian treaties were sacred events. They were done in ceremony. And the people who participated, including the colonial commissioners, by sharing those ceremonies and smoking that sacred pipe with our ancestors, it was like they were saying, we promise that we're telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. That's an aspect of treaties that were called covenants by Europeans, a religious word. It's an aspect of treaties that needs to be realized, because the breaching of those treaties is not a crime against just Indigenous peoples or against humanity. It's a crime against God.
Morris and Kelly, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and showing us the importance of all of us learning about these treaties and the role that we play in this. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
A new conservation initiative is underway on an island in Georgian Bay. It's being conducted by Shawanaga First Nation and could serve as a model for additional Indigenous-led stewardship projects in the province. Charnel Anderson covers the Northwest for Ontario hubs, and she joins us now from Red Rock on the north shore of Lake Superior for more. Hello, Charnel.
Hi, Dan.
All right, so last time you were here, we talked about how Indigenous knowledge can inform approaches to climate change. I'm hoping you can recap for us what that exactly means.
Yeah, so last time I think I mentioned that there's no universally accepted definition of Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous knowledge system, and that's still true. But what I've come to learn, is that Indigenous knowledge is really embedded in the culture, in the language, traditions, even the location where people are living. It's really intrinsic to this relationship with the land, and I think that's why Indigenous knowledge lends itself so well to climate change initiatives. A recent study from the University of British Columbia looked at vertebrate biodiversity on Indigenous managed lands. So it looked at, birds, reptiles, mammals, things with spines. And that study found that Indigenous managed lands are better at supporting vertebrate biodiversity compared to state-led protected areas. And the article didn't say much about why that's the case. But it did cite other research that found that, quote, curtailing Indigenous management involving fire, forestry, fishing, or hunting practices can cause declines in species diversity and ecosystem productivity, end quote. So I think it's clear that Indigenous knowledge and land management practices help to support biodiversity, and that in turn may help in the fight against climate change.
So let's talk about maybe closer to our home here. How is that being applied when we talk about Indigenous knowledge to conservation to protect biodiversity here?
Yeah, so that's kind of the question that I was hoping to answer as I went about reporting. How is Indigenous knowledge being used? Is it being used? Is this something that the government supports? And it turns out the answer is yes. So a few years ago, the federal government began funding Indigenous-led conservation, also called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs for short. And so I reported on Shawanaga First Nation, which is near Parry Sound, and they're developing an IPCA on Shawanaga Island, which is, as you mentioned, in Georgian Bay, and it's a culturally important spot to the community. There's lots of old growth white pine stands that survived kind of the logging mania of the last few centuries. There's culturally significant foods like cranberries and wild rice that grow out there. And so in talking to Shawanaga's IPCA coordinator, Chris Birch, he told me that, besides protecting and conserving this area, they really want it to be a place where people can go to reconnect with the land. And so they've received funding for this project, and they're working on the management plan currently to kind of sort out all the details of their IPCA.
I actually want to pull up a photo. You sort of describe sort of that beautiful scenery there, and I want to make sure our viewers see it. So tell us exactly where this sort of photo was taken and what we're sort of overlooking. I imagine, would this be sort of Georgian Bay?
Right, exactly, yeah. So this is Shawanaga Island, and I mean, you can see how beautiful it is, right? Like, of course you want to protect that.
Now, one of the things that you had talked about in terms of sort of this process is that this is a long-term project. This isn't something that is going to happen in a year or two. This is a long-term sort of project. How long is sort of this sort of commitment from the federal government with sort of Indigenous-led knowledge in terms of protecting this area?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, actually, we can kind of trace the history of this initiative back to 2018, which is when the federal government announced the Target 1 challenge. And so that's one of, I believe, 19 biodiversity goals set by the federal government. And the original goal for the Target 1 challenge was to protect 17% of land and inland water by 2020. And that has since expanded to 25% of lands and water by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And so as part of that goal, a group of experts were assembled to create ICE, the Indigenous Circle of Experts. And they did some work together, and they put together a report called We Rise Together, which explains what IPCAs are, because they do come in different shapes and sizes depending on, who's managing them, where they're managing. But they all have three things in common, according to ICE. So they're Indigenous-led, they represent a long-term commitment to conservation, and they elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities. And so that report also goes on to include recommendations for how the government can support IPCAs. So in 2018, Canada began funding IPCAs, and so far, 27 communities have received funding to establish IPCAs, and 25 other communities have received funding for preliminary work to kind of talk to the community and, maybe map out the boundaries. So that work may ultimately end up in an IPCA.
Now, when we're talking about protecting biodiversity in this area, I think we should definitely show some photos of some of those initiatives. Tell us what we're looking at here with this cute little guy.
So this guy is a Blandings turtle, and you can tell by his chin and his throat, the bright yellow. And so those guys are found in central and eastern Canada, as well as, of course, Shawanaga. And they're considered a threatened species, and that's because of habitat loss. So in 2008, they were added to the species at risk list. And then these little guys, there's kind of a neat story behind these. The community already has a species at risk program in place to support Blandings turtles and these other species. So for example, this summer, the species at risk team collected turtle eggs that were near where road construction would be taking place. So they collected the eggs, and then they incubated them, and they invited the community to come later in the summer to release the turtles back into the wetlands. So that's an example of something that's already in place, but Shawanaga wants to have additional protection measures as well in their IPCA management plan when that comes to fruition.
I actually want to pull up another photo, and I'm hoping you can sort of tell us what this depicts about the way conservation has left the Indigenous experience out of the conversation.
Yeah, so this photo, it looks like a mother and daughter. They're in Quetico Provincial Park, and they're canoeing and looking at a pictograph on a rock face. And so, there's lots of pictographs in the area because Anishinaabe people lived there prior to colonization and created the pictograph. But in 1909, the province made this area, it's over 1 million hectare area in northwestern Ontario, into a forest reserve. And that has since become a provincial park, Quetico Provincial Park. And so not long after the government created the park, the Indigenous people that lived there and kind of, had taken care of the land for thousands of years were kicked out of the area. So to me, that photo is kind of like a stark representation of the history of conservation in Canada, which, oftentimes involves removing Indigenous people from the land for non-Indigenous people to, come in and use it as recreation.
We have about a minute left, but I do want to ask you, the Indigenous circle of experts talk about how, the effects of previous Canadian governments to create sort of parks and protected areas wasn't really centered on necessarily the health and well-being of nature. And I'm curious, you kind of outlined sort of one of the key things in this is being Indigenous-led. How does this initiative sort of help towards reconciliation?
Right. I think, there's one source that I talked to, Rachel Plotkin from the David Suzuki Foundation, who said, in addition to the obvious benefits around conservation and protection and biodiversity, IPCs are beneficial in that they return governance to Indigenous people, which in turn allows them to honor their legal rights and sense of responsibility to the land. And Rachel also pointed out that, this is in line with the land back movement. IPCAs, can potentially give Indigenous people control over land taken away during the process of colonization. So I think in that sense, there is some potential for this to have benefits for reconciliation.
A really great story. Thank you so much, Charnel. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jan.
The agenda this week examined toxic cultures in professional sports, got political with Giller Prize-winning novelist Ian Williams, and reviewed China's past decade of expansion with journalist Joanna Chu. The agenda's Week in Review begins getting perspective on what's being called the Great Resignation.
one of the things that could be driving what we're dabbling at calling a Great Resignation is just that people have had a period of time to be very self-reflective and think about what's next. And maybe some people are investing in themselves in the very same way that we expect people to invest themselves in terms of new training, reskilling for this thing called the future of work, right? So to the extent that the Great Resignation is people making different career moves or changes, I actually think that could be a fantastic thing for Canada, but it's not quite bearing out in the data just yet.
Right, and we'll pick up on that in just a few minutes. Dina, how about to you? To the extent that it's happening in Canada, what do you think is driving it?
I mean, I don't really see it as the Great Resignation. I think it's kind of like a protest. I think a lot of workers are saying we actually don't want to go back to work that is stressful, that is precarious, that is unsafe, where we constantly have to be thinking about, you know, how to protect ourselves and how to protect our families when we go home. For sure, there are those folks who have been able to retrain and take this moment. But I think for a lot of workers, they're also saying, you know what, if you want me to come back to work, you got to change those working conditions. And I'm not prepared for this kind of, you know, bad job anymore.
Robin, what has your reporting uncovered in this area?
I say this as a reporter and also as a mother of a 2- and 4-year-old. I think it's survival. I think especially anyone who's had little children through the last year and a half, you are pushed to the brink every day with no end in sight, and that forces you to make some changes.
Make some changes and sort of fill in that blank a little bit more. What have you done?
What have I done? Well, I spend most weekends working. That's one example. So it's been a real interesting year as we've been at the Globe unrolling our Power Gap series, which is something we started before the pandemic, and it's been looking at gender inequities in the workplace. And I have to say, I hope my editors aren't listening, but the series is, you know, I have some stories that we're supposed to run by now, but just can't. Last week, I had to take 3 days off work because my 2-year-old had a cough and we had to go get COVID tests, and I had to get a COVID test. And my 4-year-old can't go to school when my 2-year-old is off waiting for a COVID test, which means I end up working on the weekends. And I worked 2 nights once my husband got home from work to make up the time. And this is just, you know, not an unusual week for me. This has been a constant barrage for the last year and a half. And I know it's been constant for so many parents out there, and especially this like double whammy of, especially earlier on, where you couldn't rely on grandparents, you couldn't rely on those people that usually help you carry water through these types of regular childhood illnesses. It's been so hard, and I'm really lucky that I work at a workplace that's very flexible and lets me take these extra types of shifts to make up the time, but so many people do not have that kind of flexibility, and I have no idea how they're doing it.
But Dina, let me put this to you, and you tell me if there's anything to it. We've for many, many years had employees here in the province of Ontario who feel underappreciated, who feel they're not being paid enough, who feel their workplaces aren't safe enough, who, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and yet they've still gone to work anyway for the most part. We are starting to see data that suggests, certainly in the States, to a lesser extent here, people aren't putting up with that as much anymore. What's the straw that's breaking the camel's back this time?
I mean, I think that there's 2 or 3 different scenarios, because of course we're dealing with a mass amount of workers. I mean, there are those workers who didn't have a choice during the pandemic to stay at home, and they've just had to go to work and put up with the kinds of working conditions that we know are to be true and that have been exposed during the pandemic. So, you know, short-term, part-time, temp agency work. Then there are those workers who, you know, we're working in the sort of low wage sector, in entertainment, hospitality, tourism, the restaurant industry. And I think finally got a bit of a chance out of the grind of that daily type of work. Because when you're working 12 to 14 hours a day and you're in that daily grind, it's hard to imagine doing anything else. And I think for some folks who are in those minimum wage jobs, say in the restaurant sector, they have taken this opportunity to move into another area of work, which I think has been great. And then there are people, like Robin, who have little kids or who have kids who have not been able to be vaccinated yet, and who basically are feeling like they're going to put their lives and their children's lives at risk during a pandemic, and so have chosen to not go back to work and have made that really brutal decision, because it's meant that for many people, they're now working 2 or 3 jobs, or they're doing split shifts, or they're trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And so we are seeing huge rising debt, poverty, and a massive increase in stress of people trying to figure out how to deal with this new labor market. But I think the biggest issue here is also how to also stay healthy and well and keep their families safe during this time period.
There seems to be something about the NBA and about basketball where they do these things sort of better than everybody else. They don't seem to have, they have different kinds of scandals, but not this kind of scandal. Any ideas about that?
I mean, the idea that comes to mind is that the NBA, and maybe to a smaller extent the other 3 major leagues in North America, are being dragged along by their labor. They're being dragged along by people who have an eye to the public, an eye to public conscience, that can't really hide their identities when they're on the ice or when they're on the court. The NBA has kind of set aside an example where the players have dictated terms, in a sense, been able to kind of push the issue, and has moved the league to kind of be a partner, not just a partner with the players, but just in their communities. When Jacob Blake, he was a black man who was shot by police in Kenosha, Wisconsin in 2020. We say the WNBA, but the movement I'm about to describe is more descriptive of the WNBA and other women's sports. Players started to walk off the job in protest. It was widespread, it was effective, and it had impacts in different ways of life. A lot of academics here in Canada actually spoke about how the impact of that walk-off changed how leagues how as partners can be more involved and more engaged with not just players, but the fan bases. And we saw that the NBA, for example, opened their arenas. A lot of member franchises became election centers and became facilities for vaccinations and other uses. So, owners and governors within the NBA, they had to listen because they had no choice. Because without their players, what is it?
Now, that's a great point. Bruce, let me get you to comment on that, because the fact is the NBA has almost all the time, not in the case of China, but almost all the time encouraged their players to speak freely, to put slogans on their shirts. They were the first league to close down during COVID. Seems to me NHL players, conversely, tend to be very apolitical and really don't want to get into controversies at all when they speak. Maybe you could contrast and compare, Bruce, the 2 cultures there and tell us why that is.
Well, there's fundamental difference when it comes to empowerment within the sport, right? In hockey, it's more about the team than it is about the individual, even with star players. The idea in Canadian Olympic hockey that if Sidney Crosby can back check, so can you. The fact that the sport allows great players to be dragged down by the lesser players in the sport. There's a misguided egalitarianism, I would say, is probably the way to describe that. Whereas in basketball, there's so much more empowerment of players. But then you get into, so the idea that the leagues are more progressive, the NBA is clearly ahead of any other league on this. The NBA is the most forward-thinking league, the most socially progressive league, but Perry's exactly right. A huge part of that is because of their labor. It dovetails with their business interests to do so, because in the NBA, if you lose your players, then you have significant problems. Now, the other side of this is the NHL. The NHL has leaden instincts when it comes to things not only in hockey, but outside of hockey. When the George Floyd protests erupted after he was shot in Minnesota, the NHL it waited. It kept playing, right? Like while other leagues shut down. When COVID happened, they were the last league to stop playing, right? Like the NBA, within a half hour of Rudy Gobert testing positive, shut the league down. The NHL waited until the next day. You can come back to the Kyle Beach situation here. The instincts of the NHL were really, really poor in that they fined the team $2 million, which is a relatively minor fine in the context of previous fines for misbehavior in the NHL. The players drive the agenda in the NBA to a significant degree, and it's a business-related kind of, again, dovetailing of interests. And maybe that's why there have been fewer examples of players being taken advantage of in significantly deleterious ways, because the players have more agency in basketball than they do in almost any other sport.
The title of the book is Disorientation. What did you mean by that?
So disorientation for me is the response that racialized people have to random or unprovoked reminders of our race. So we're going about our business, just doing our thing, and then someone interrupts our life to tell us about someone they know who likes reggae, or to ask where you're from, or some other kind of indication that says you are other, right? In this moment, you are a black subject, and you are no longer the guy just trying to buy a shirt at H&M. Yeah, so that's disorientation. And I guess the second part to that, Nam, is that the recovery of that, from that disorientation, also burns up so much mental energy for people of color.
I think some people might hear that and say, so what? It's just maybe you're being too sensitive. Maybe the person is complimenting you because you remind them of Michael Jordan, whatever it is. But what does it do to the person who's getting that message?
Right. Yeah, I don't know about people's intentions. I don't read hearts or anything like that for a living. But I know its effect on me to snap me out of the task that I'm doing and then to refocus. People say this about the internet too, right? Like, you're doing one thing, you get sidetracked, and it takes, 15 minutes to get back on track? Now imagine that in like human terms. You're trying to focus on something or trying to do your job, you get snapped out of it, and how much mental energy do you burn up on your commute back? Or, when you could be having really sort of engaged moments with your family, processing the day's events through a racial lens.
Why write a book of essays in this particular time on this subject?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, last year when I began, I was living in Vancouver at the time. There were wildfires. There was a pandemic really starting to take hold here in North America. And of course, the justice movements that started in the US and spread around the world. And I put aside the novel that I was working on in order to write this book. It had a kind of urgency to it. I turned 40 a few years ago. And to be honest with you, I was kind of confused internally. There was a lot of noise that was happening externally.
Confused about what?
Confused about how this world can still exist, although we all know better, right? I mean, the social system can still exist and the justice system can still propagate injustices, although we all know better. And all of the noise that I was hearing around me was kind of similar to the noise inside of me. So I decided, Ian, there's no safety on shore, right? There's no safety trying to avoid this kind of conversation. You need to figure out what you think, and you need to understand how this world is working, because it's affecting you and breaking you down on a daily basis. And so that's the urgency and the impetus behind this book, Nam.
You said that you were avoiding it, and you write, I know a fair bit, but never enough to seize authority. My dissatisfaction with my knowledge, coupled with my tepid emotions, occasionally nauseates me. Would I not be a better human if I were informed and angry? Then I could be righteous. I should be vocal, more than vocal, loud. I have received the message that to be Black these days is to be perpetually outraged and distressed, fed up, tired. To be anything apart from that is treacherous and out of touch. Is that what you mean?
Wow. Yeah. So I admire activists. I admire people who are very vocal, and I admire those people who are on the front lines, doing work in our courts and our civil systems. But not all of us have the fortitude or temperament to do that kind of racial work. And so the fact that a Black person in a moment of injustice is quiet doesn't mean that that Black person does not care or is not necessarily engaged. There are features of personality too that determine how we respond to tragedy. Some of us get sad, some of us just drink ourselves into forgetfulness, right? And what I wanted to do in that quotation is recognize what's expected of us and then give people of color options or ways to be themselves still, right? That we don't have to sacrifice ourselves to some kind of single universal idea of what Blackness is or does. We can care and we can further progress in our own ways.
Well, here's the voice of China answering back. This is from a state-run organ called Global Times. And here's the comment. Canada, the UK, and Australia, 3 members of the Five Eyes Alliance, have recently taken action to put pressure on China. They have formed a US-centered, racist, and mafia-styled community, willfully and arrogantly provoking China and trying to consolidate their hegemony as all gangsters do. They are becoming a racist axis aimed at stifling the development rights of 1.4 billion Chinese. The formation of 4 states, except the UK, is the result of British colonization. Those countries share the Anglo-Saxon civilization. With a common language, a common historical background, and a coordinated attack target, such an axis is destined to erode international relations and allow hooliganism to rise to the diplomatic stage. Global diplomacy in the 21st century must not be hijacked by a fake international community with an axis of white supremacy. I hear you laughing, but that's axis of white supremacy. What do you make of that kind of language?
What's interesting in that statement is it reflects some of the main talking points that the CCP uses to try to discredit international criticism. Canada, and along with other states, have been trying to work more on a multilateral level to put pressure on Beijing against what is happening, like the internment of around 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps in Xinjiang. Countries feel that speaking as a group, they have a stronger voice than alone, which I think makes a lot of sense. But Beijing is trying to shape this and make it seem like a racist attack, that any criticism of China is racist. And they're really, really deliberately trying to encourage conflation of the Chinese people, the 1.4 billion Chinese people, citizens, and the Chinese state. What is concerning to me is that while this seems ridiculous when you see it, flash across the screen, many people in the West do conflate Chinese people and the Chinese state. Former President Donald Trump, he has said repeatedly that he thinks all international students from China are spies, that they should be treated as spies. And scientists in the US have been persecuted and, found that there was no basis to these persecutions. And a lot of experts on China worry that this Red Scare, this conflation of the CCP and the Chinese people, is playing into what Beijing most wants to see. It wants to paralyze more productive and nuanced dialogue in the West by making it seem as if this is a racist attack that is just going to stoke xenophobia. Unfortunately, in the West, we haven't been very nuanced in showing that that's not what they're saying. We're not conflating the people of the states. And in my reporting, I draw on decades of warnings and testimonials from people of Chinese descent in countries like Canada, where they've been trying to warn that Beijing has been trying to do this, trying to support these narratives. But time and again, they have been ignored. They've been ignored. Now they continue to feel very just not supported. Myself, when I have reported on human rights in Xinjiang and received hundreds of threatening messages going to the police, they tell me there's nothing they could do. Talking to the Bill Blair's office and Ministry of Public Safety. Meanwhile, they say Canadians who feel concerned about threats from foreign sources should go to the police. But when people go to the police say there's nothing they can do. So it's kind of a circular response people get from from authorities that make them feel really unsupported, and that it's playing into this myth that people of Chinese descent are this homogenous group that all support what Beijing is doing, which isn't true.
You just used the word nuance there in that answer, and I think, if memory serves, about 3/4 of the way through the book, you talk about the fact that we're not living in times where we do nuance very well, and these are times in which maybe being able to act on a global stage with a little more nuance would be very helpful. What do we do about that?
So the cabinet in the U.S. Canada just had a reshuffling of the cabinet. But in general, people tell me that they worry there's not enough expertise on China advising governments. The Liberal Party in Canada, and definitely, many ruling parties in Canada, most of their advisors on China have been people in the business world, where, of course, they have really valuable lived experiences doing business in China, but they also have vested interests, and they also have interests in making sure that relations are as friendly as possible so it doesn't affect the business relationship.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, November 5th, 2021. Monday, as new federal cabinet ministers settle into their roles, we'll examine what their appointments suggest about the parliament to come. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.